All right, joining me now once again here on the Matthew Filipovich Show is my good friend Kade Crockford. Kade is the Privacy Rights Coordinator at the ACLU of Massachusetts, which you can find at ACLU-M.org. She also writes the Privacy SOS blog, which is privacysos.org. Kade, thanks so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so Kade, both you and I live in Boston, Massachusetts. We've had a horrible week and a half or so here. But on top of that, right now, after the attacks at the Boston Marathon, there have been some who are calling for increased surveillance. There's some who have been calling for perhaps drones to be flown over Boston. Let me just hear, what are your thoughts on those ideas?
Well, we saw after 9/11 that the country responded with a great amount of fear and sadness, obviously, about the horrible attack. And I think that we've seen sort of similar responses after Boston. I think that we need to be very careful not to repeat some of the mistakes that we made after 9/11 and that we actually still haven't addressed or fixed. For example, the government rushed through the passage of the Patriot Act, which I am pretty sure a majority of the population opposes, allowing, essentially eating away at the Fourth Amendment in ways that are potentially unconstitutional and definitely contrary to the values that we believe in this country, such as presumption of innocence and the notion that the government should not be involved in your private life or spying on you unless it has reason to believe that you're involved in some sort of a crime. So, our view is that when something terrible happens like this, our response needs to be really be to cling to the things that make us who we are. And we believe that those things are core American principles of justice. And we shouldn't turn away from them. We shouldn't weaken them. We need to, if anything, strengthen them at times like this. When we're tested, people are talking about Boston strong, how strong Boston is. Let's really be strong and let's hold firm in our values. Let's make sure that if Ed Davis, the police commissioner of the Boston Police Department, who wants to fly drones over the marathon next year and, potentially also over our houses, if the BPD wants surveillance drones, we need to make sure that we have reasonable checks and balances in place that are backed up by the force of law to ensure that these technologies are not abused, that the core principles of American justice, like I said, that, the government shouldn't be in our business unless it has a good reason to believe we're up to no good, that holds true even in times when our principles and our physical safety are tested.
Absolutely. And it's also, I think, a good question that, it's one, I think it's definitely against core values, but just the idea that this extra invasions of privacy actually does anything to actually stop terrorism or prevent terrorism is also a pretty big question we have to also ask.
Yeah, that's a really important part of this as well. So, of course, whenever we're talking about a new government surveillance power or a new technology, we have to look at two things. One is efficacy, like you said. Does it even work? And the second is does the use of does this new power comport with our values, comport with our law, comport with our Constitution? And does this technology, is there a way we can use this technology so that it doesn't violate those principles? And I think in many cases, there are ways that we can use surveillance technologies. Look, my website is a lot of scary stuff about what's going on in this country, well before
it really is the most frightening website on the whole World Wide Web. It's if you want to be frightened and shaking, that's the site to go to.
Right. So yeah, don't read it before bed, but it's nice to read it in the morning. It wakes you up. So you'll look at that website and you'll see things from the Patriot Act to the FISA Amendments Act passed in 2008 and then reauthorized just in December of 2012 last year, all sorts of broad expansions of the government's power to invade our privacy, sometimes without warrants even, sometimes with, general warrants, which actually should be unconstitutional in this country. So there have been a whole host of ways in which the government has taken all sorts of power, particularly in the decade after 9/11. And you're right. I mean, we saw that all of those measures that we were told we had to swallow, right, in order to protect our physical bodies, didn't. And they fell short. And they didn't protect our physical bodies from, the numerous people who have shot up public accommodations, schools, movie theaters, whatever, killing scores of people. The government is never going to be able to stop every person who has a deranged plan to murder people from doing so. It's just not possible. There were surveillance cameras up and down the route of the marathon. Those, the suspects that the FBI and the police have identified, they were captured on numerous cameras. That did not deter them. They were not deterred by the surveillance cameras that were already in place. And, there's no question that the surveillance cameras that were there are going to, or already have, helped law enforcement considerably in terms of identifying the suspects. There's no question about that. But we have to be very clear about the fact that there is no evidence to suggest that surveillance cameras or surveillance drones, prevent heinous acts of crime or terrorism, large-scale violence. There's just no evidence to suggest that. So, when Davis says that they want more cameras around the city, I think that we really have to look at the facts, right? I mean, one of the facts is that the cameras that were already there were plenty of them, did not stop the attack. And the second fact is that they used the cameras to great effect to identify their suspects. So I think that in some sense, the commissioner is maybe identifying a problem that doesn't really exist. The ACLU does not oppose the use of surveillance cameras at high-profile events like the Boston Marathon, places where a lot of people are gathering in public, that's, what terrorism experts call soft targets. We're not stupid. We live in this city, too. I live in this city, too. My family could have been there, I don't want the people who did that to get away with it. I would like for them to be caught. But I also recognize that, no number of surveillance cameras, London has more surveillance cameras than any city in the world. And that did not stop people from blowing themselves up on trains and killing a bunch of people. So I think we just have to, it's a time when a lot of emotions are running really high, but I do think it's important for people to think critically about what it actually means for us to put more surveillance cameras on the streets, and not just that, but where and how and what the rules around those surveillance cameras are. Are they going to retain the data forever? Are those systems networked so that, FBI officials can watch them from D.C., watch us walking down the street getting a cup of coffee? Are those surveillance cameras going to be equipped with high-tech video analytics that enable an officer who's monitoring the cameras to click on an image of you, and then the cameras automatically track you as you move through the city from camera to camera? Technologies like that exist, and I think we really have to, we have to drill down into those more complicated and difficult questions. Simply saying we need more cameras on the streets, it might make people feel safer, but the question really is, does it make people actually safer? And, the second question is, let's drill down a little bit to understand the details of those proposals, because it's one thing to put more cameras in high-profile areas where there, like I said, are public events, lots of people gathering, and it's quite something else to put them in residential neighborhoods, right? It's quite something else to put cameras, on every street corner, so that from the moment you leave your house until the moment you come back in your house that night, you are on camera somewhere.
Yeah.
I don't know that people in this society want to be ubiquitously monitored everywhere we go. And that I think brings us to another subject, which is that, the surveillance, the surveillance state that has been created over the past 12 years has really been created in the shadows, and it hasn't been something that has the public has not been involved, right, in conversations, democratic processes. It hasn't really happened. And so I think this is an opportunity for people in Boston to say, okay, the police commissioner says he wants more cameras. Let's really think about this. Let's have a public conversation. Let's make sure that the people who, A, pay for these technologies, right, because it's our tax money, and B, are the ones who benefit from the supposed public safety benefits, but also potentially lose out if our privacy is violated. We need to be a part of that conversation, and not just the ACLU, but ordinary people who, when they walk out of their houses, from the time they walk out of their houses until the time they go home, potentially could be monitored. I think people really need to get engaged in those conversations and, talk to your city officials, get in touch with the police department yourself if you're concerned about those issues.
Absolutely. And before we move on, because I actually want to move on to the kind of the idea of that's being talked about as well, which is that's being talked about in all types of press, which is a very dangerous conversation about radicalization and what exactly that means. I actually want to bring up one more thing. One thing that's also happening, there's been an expansion of bag checks on like trains and buses, which also, that's another thing that does a bag check actually make you safer from a terror attack? I think obviously the answer is no, because they can just blow up the checkpoint where the bag check is happening. It doesn't actually. It's another kind of invasion of privacy, which when you actually look at it, does not actually make you any safer at all from a potential strike.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll say about that, because I think you covered it, is that when the day after these horrific attacks in Boston, the commander of the state police spoke to the public and he said, look, there's going to be, or maybe this was even that night, he said, look, there's going to be a stepped-up police presence, even a military presence. We're going to have bag checks on the trains. You're going to see a lot more uniformed people and a lot of people with big guns. And he actually said explicitly that they were doing that not because the police thought that there was going to be an attack or because they had specific information about somebody who they were worried about. He said explicitly that was going to be done to make people feel safe. So, security scholars like Bruce Schneer call that security theater, right? It's the notion that, big men in uniforms with guns, simply their presence makes people feel relaxed, and therefore it isn't really about whether or not we are safe. It's more about our perceptions of our own safety. And so I think people should really think very carefully about what that means as well.